So hello and welcome everybody. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. This is the CSCCE monthly community call, and this month we're talking about planning and evaluating accessible virtual events. So we have three presenters from our CSCCE community of practice. So they're going to be walking us through various aspects of virtual event planning. I'm Lou Woodley, I'm Director of the Centre. I'm very happy to see all of you here today. And so I co-organised this call with Katie Pratt. Katie's our Communications Director and Content Archivist, and she's going to be sharing links in the chat today to help you keep oriented with various things that are going on. So I know there's various people on the call that are here for the first time, so welcome. We're very happy that you are here. As a point of orientation, I want to start by highlighting CSCCE's core values. So these values were created with our community members, and they're really in service of us having an inclusive and safe experience together in all of the spaces in which we meet. So we strive to embody these 5 core values as we work to create an inclusive, supportive and engaging environment so that we can all learn and grow together. And so the 5 values that we have are that we continuously strive to be inclusive, we empower one another, we learn and share, we trust and hold space for one another, and we express gratitude and recognition. So we highlight these at the start of every community call to encourage your engagement with this call in the spirit of those values. And you can read examples of the definitions of those values and what the example behaviours are, what those values look like in action on our website, if you want to explore that some more. So today, as I said, we're going to be thinking about planning and evaluating virtual events. And so we're going to have 3 speakers from the CSCCE community of practice. So I'm going to walk us through a few logistics as promised, just to make sure that everybody knows how you're welcome to participate today. And then we'll start by thinking about event planning. So Tom is going to walk us through a talk that he's entitled, "It's Dangerous to Go Alone, Take This, Non-Player Characters and Prepping for Your Virtual Event." So Tom's going to talk for about 15 minutes. Then our second presentation is all about accessibility. So thinking about how to plan meetings that reach wider audiences. And Rebecca's going to be presenting about that. And then our third presentation is thinking about how we evaluate virtual events. And so Emily is going to be presenting about evaluation. We will have time for 1 or 2 questions between those presentations, and that will all add up to hopefully take us to approximately the hour. And then the way our community calls work is we have an hour of scheduled activities, and then if you would like to stay on for a further 30 minutes, we continue the discussions then. So we allow things to broaden out, we allow a bit more reflection for you to jump in and talk about your own experiences with the topic. So please do stay along for the full 90 minutes if you can. But if you can't, then the first 60 minutes will be recorded and you're welcome to leave at that point. Okay, so the way our calls work is that we take notes in a Google Doc. So Katie will be sharing a link to that doc now if you haven't seen it already. There's an attendee section in there, so if you're comfortable, please do put your name, your organisation, and whereabouts in the world that you're located. And then there are various other sections where you can take virtual notes if that helps you to concentrate. The doc will be available in view-only mode afterwards, so it acts as an ongoing resource to come back to if you want to revisit anything that we talked about during the call. You can also use the doc to suggest questions for the speakers, so don't feel you have to hold on to those until right at the end. Pop those in the doc in the question section as you think of them. And then Steph on the call, Steph Butland, she's our moderator and will interrupt and jump in with questions at the appropriate points. So we'll make sure that those get voiced. And then if you're not yet in our Slack group, we have an active group there. So Katie will be popping the link into the chat now. So if you're not yet in the Slack and you'd like to join, do request to join, and we tend to get back to you within a couple of days and help you to get oriented there. And then finally, before I hand over to the speakers, I want to just point out a few other resources that CSCCE has on the topic of virtual events. So you may have seen that yesterday we released a brand new guidebook that's focused on running virtual events. And the first section of that we've released has 12 different event format recipes. So you can pick a recipe, you can see the rationale for using that recipe. There are various bullet point checklists of things that you need to pull off that particular format of events, and tips and tricks shared by different community managers from within our community of practice who have expertise in running that particular event format. So that's a super resource, and we do recommend you check that out if you haven't had a look at it yet. That resource is listed on the resource page for organising community events. That includes another fantastic guidebook which is related to in-person events, so do check that out. That was produced by one of the project teams of the 2019 fellows, and that talks about convening inclusive meetings for scientists in a range of different in-person formats. So that's a companion guide. We've also curated resources from our blog. So the most recent of which is a really great 3-part series of blog posts talking about translating CSVConf online this year. So lots of reflections from the organisers of that conference about what they've learned. There's also another post about the Turing Way Book Dash. So again, thinking about a different kind of event format. This was an in-person one before the lockdown happened. Okay, so that's all that I wanted to say in terms of getting us oriented. So Tom, it's over to you now to help us to think about planning events.
Great, thank you very much, Lou. I'm just going to share my screen now, and we'll do a little share screen check, as well as a sound check. Okay, can everybody see my screen? And you can still hear me?
Yep, great, thank you.
Phenomenal, alrighty. I'm going to go ahead and get started because I've got quite a bit to go through, and let's just do another check that when I present, you can still see the loading. And first slide, yes?
Looks good.
Great. So it's dangerous to go alone. Take this, non-player characters and prepping for your virtual event. I am Tom Quigley. I'm the community manager at ConservationXLabs. I was a fellow in 2019 for the CSCCE and a couple of relevant Twitter handles below. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is planning for the virtual event. You know, you've identified that you want to do one, you're working towards it, and what you need to do before the day of event to make sure that your event is a success. And so to go through here, we're going to start with why should you do instead of what should you do from the very first thinking around wanting to run a virtual event. And then following that, we'll talk about dry runs and how you can do preliminary events to learn from iteration. Finally, NPCs, non-player or non-participant characters, and a Q&A at the very end. And I won't be able to follow along with the chat, but I see I'm just checking in now, and thank you very much. I'll share the resource for the PowerPoint afterwards, and you all know how you can also make very pretty ones very easily and free. All right, let's get started. So let's start with why you should do, not what you should do. Before you think about starting a virtual event, you should start with why. What are the outcomes that you want to achieve with a virtual event? What do you want your community to take away? So instead of starting with what, as in starting with, I know that I want to run a online hackathon, or I know that I want to run a virtual happy hour. Start with your outcomes. Start with what you actually hope that your community will be able to do, that they will take away, how they will grow, the things that you want to be able to talk about and show success for. And from there, you will go into what event type will fulfill those goals. And this is the CSCCE Virtual Events Guidebook is an incredible resource for this, where you can start with those, what kind of a thing do I want my community to do would show a successful output for this year of the event. And then go through some of those recipes that they have there and see what types of events might help fulfill some of those. And then once you have an idea of what type of event you want to run, then you can start thinking about what technology can we use to facilitate this best. So it could be just one, it could be more than one. It might be as simple as doing a Zoom call with a bunch of people on it. It might be as complex as having 4 or 5 or 10 different types of technology that work together over the course of a multi-day event. So, we're in a virtual world now where not everything is, we're not able to be together and have these, in-person running events. And I like to say that running a virtual event, running a real life event is like herding cats. Running a virtual event is like herding cats with blindfold on. You've got a whole bunch of people that are attending, but they're invisible and you can't tell what they're doing, if they're lost or if they're even still with you. So the facilitating the technology is really important for what you're hoping to do with your event. As an example of this, in April of this year, we ran an ideathon, which is like a hackathon, except the outputs are to come up with early ideas. And the reason we started with why, the reason that we wanted to run this event is because we have a prize that goes every year, and the prize is for the best conservation ideas. And then the winners, 20 winners of that, will be given funding for about $3,500 to create a prototype of that idea. And so we wanted to create an event that would facilitate the creation of more ideas that would be able to directly submit to the prize that we were running at that time that year. And so this ideathon idea came out of that, from those highest level goals. It was a 6-hour event on a Saturday. We had 500 people register and formed 100 teams. Almost all of those teams stayed through the entire 6-hour event. There were 17 expert mentors that we coordinated to go into each of those teams and give feedback, 12 facilitators who helped move those teams along, and 3 organizers watching over the whole thing with a slightly terrified eye from our remote apartments. And like I was saying about that tech stack, where a stack meaning that all of the different technologies that you use to facilitate your event, we used, probably that's 9, Hopin, Airtable, Slack, Google Docs, YouTube Live, some custom JavaScript, Qualtrics, Zoom, and Drip, an email marketing tool, to bring the whole thing together and make sure that people have the experience from beginning to end. So it can be, up to that complex and involving many, many different moving parts here. So the tips that I'm going to give for the rest of this presentation can work for anything from a Zoom call with a group of, 15 to 50 people, all the way up to something as complex as this. So let's talk about dry runs and working with trialing your event in a live dry run before the event actually starts. Why would you do a dry run? There's a couple of really good reasons. The first reason is testing. If you have an idea of the schedule and the programming that you want your participants to be able to do over the course of your event, you're able to actually try that content out on real people with a dry run. And then you can iterate on your schedule, your content, your tech choices, take the learnings from that first event and build those learnings into your next version leading up to your final event. And then when you get to your final event, you'll be able to run it with confidence. You will launch your event without the nerves, and you won't have that, that scariness of, what if the internet goes out? What if this live streaming doesn't work? Because you've already tested it and you've mitigated as much risk as you possibly could in those dry runs. How many should you do? I say that you should do at least one dry run, unless everyone in the event is completely confident that it is going to go fine. I say at least one because, first of all, your tech choices are always going to be a little funny. You want to check your sound, your video, your lighting, your technology choice if you're using something new, internet connectivity. A lot of the time somebody, maybe just got new internet installed in the apartment and it drops out every once in a while. You'll want to know that ahead of time. You'll want to check the content of your schedule. So maybe you have some programming and activities that you want your people to do, or maybe you just want to tell information kind of from one to many. The content of your schedule matters, and being able to talk to your participants and understand, did that content land, is a really valuable asset of a dry run so that you can iterate on it before your final. And lastly, just reading your script, that activity of saying out loud things before you actually get to the live version will make you more confident and more comfortable in actually presenting what you're planning on saying. Sometimes you have a very complex event, you may want to do more than one. So a couple of things that may flag to you that you need to do more than one dry run are if attendees are expected to do work during the event, if you're going to give them programming to do so. If attendees will move, quote unquote, and go from one room to another, a breakout room or between different technologies. If you have more than 3 guest speakers, that's an arbitrary number, but that also matters a little bit about the tech fluency of those guest speakers. If you're using a new technology choice, if you're something that you or others may not be familiar with, or if you have a very tight schedule that you need to work your way through and really not get off of and don't have a lot of flexibility to move around through the day, those are indications that you may want to do multiple dry runs to check those before your final day of event. For the Ideathon, I wish I had done this many. This is mostly my learnings of what I had wished I had done, is a 4-week before alpha, a 3-week before beta, a 2-week before dry run, and a 1-week before dress rehearsal. And this is in an ideal world, of course. You may not be able to get enough people to actually come to be the sort of the participants of all of these events. But even if you do 1 or 2 of these is a really valuable way to learn a lot about your final event, what it'll actually be like. The alpha event is about testing your technology choices. If it's something very familiar, like Zoom, that everybody else is familiar with, then that's one thing. But we used a new platform called Hopin, and it was new to everyone, including us. And so we had a lot to learn about, would we actually be able to use the technology that we'd chosen to facilitate the schedule and the programming that we wanted to do. That's so far before, because those choices really matter about how you're going to, the big changes that you might need to make and search for other technologies before your event. Then in the beta, you want to test your schedule, your programming and content. You really want to put that forward here and show people and see if they can follow the instructions and engage with that programming the right way. The learnings from this will roll back into your programming, into your schedule. I'm sorry, that's related to the dry run. I switched those in my mind. Dry run and schedule are pretty closely related, because your schedule is going to be like, is there enough time to actually do the things in my schedule? Did I plan out, I may have set 30 minutes for this, but it's actually an hour-long presentation once we got into it. So understanding the relationship between those. The dry run is more about the content and thinking, does this do what I need it to do? Are the instructions clear? Am I getting the outputs that I want? And finally, the dress rehearsal is really where you're just polishing burrs off and thinking, okay, most of this should be in order. My tech choices, my schedule is appropriate to the time that it'll actually take, and my content is well understood. So this is just a confirmation event that you're able to actually run before the final event and just get all of the, work out all of the final kinks. So in our event, we had an idea about non-player characters, and non-player characters is an idea that comes from video games, where there's, as you play through it, there's plenty of people positioned along your path that you will help guide you and move you towards the final event, keep you playing the game. And we had a lot of non-player characters in the Ideathon event, and to spice things up, I want to use an allegory to an all-time favorite video game of mine. So your first non-player character that's really important and covers a lot of different virtual events is your presenter. And here I've got Professor Oak from Pokemon. And who are they? It's a topic expert that you'll bring on to share information direct to your attendees. And their key roles are really to share a slideshow, talk through a presentation, and then take a question and answer. So it's what I'm doing right now. Your goal as the organizer is to ensure that the sharing works. And if you can get a copy of the presentation beforehand in case anything happens, maybe they just simply don't show up on the day of, or the internet falls out mid-presentation. If you can have that copy, then you can pick right up where they left off. You'll want to ensure that the connectivity and the sound works. For example, if you were going to play a Pokemon theme song, you would want to make sure that the sound volume was high enough that everybody who was actually participating could hear it. You want to make sure that the presenter is familiar with the tech choice of your event, so that you don't end up bringing somebody onto something that they are completely seeing for the first time and don't know where the share button is, for example. And as an organizer, you're going to want to curate some of the questions and answers for that, because in a larger event, you may not just be able to have a free-for-all and people will just stand up and have You will also maybe want facilitators. On larger events, this is where this is going to get more important. And facilitators are sort of like mini me of you that will be able to work with more like the smaller groups of people and facilitate individual questions and keep things moving. They are people who help move the schedule along and facilitate teamwork, fielding simple questions and things like that. So key roles will be to join breakout groups and field questions or field questions from individuals, to keep teams on task and on time if you have any breakout activities, and to report up to the organizers on how things are going or if there's anything that's significantly going wrong. Common questions, things like that. Your goal as an organizer is to ensure that facilitators have a really deep understanding of a schedule and the technology, because they're going to be getting questions from people and they need to be confident in their answers. They also need to know where to go to get many of those common answers. So provide them with common questions and scripts to answers that they may end up seeing. If they have something that they can't understand, you'll want to provide a pathway to elevate that up to an organizer to say, hey, this is actually urgent and probably is happening to everyone, or for whatever reason, there's something really urgent. But your goal is to pre-train them with as much information that they won't need to do that much, and you'll only be brought the most important things that you need to deal with. And you'll want to make sure that they have a very clear communication channel so that both they can elevate to you, but also so that you can coordinate them. At our Ideathon, most of my time was spent cueing the facilitators and saying, it's now 2:30, you should be moving on to this activity. Please go into your room and tell everybody to move on, etc. So your coordination with them has to be a two-way channel. A support person is very valuable as well. And these are points of contact for attendees to help solve their problems. Often these are tech problems, but sometimes it's just clarity problems around schedule and other things. And so their key roles are to find and field requests for support, to provide support, both from the tech side and also schedule or clarity or other programming, and to elevate really urgent support to you so that you can help deal with it. Now, it's really useful if you can find a support person that is very tech savvy and can deal with some of those very, a big potential tech problem themselves. If they know more than you, that's great. And so your goal for them is to create a clear pathway to the attendees and make sure that they know who that support person is and how to find that person. So maybe that's a little widget in the bottom that you click and it pops up and it just connects straight to them. Maybe it's a tech channel, maybe it's a Google Doc where they can ask their tech questions or direct messaging. However it is, you want to make sure that they know who to go to and how to get to them. You'll also want to make sure that, similar to the facilitators, these support staff have a pathway that they can elevate really important stuff to you as an organizer and to maintain clear communication channels both ways throughout the event. Your goal as the organizer is to manage these people and to only take on individual fires if it's a big enough fire that they need to raise it to you. And finally, you've got a mentor, which is a kind of a more event specific. You may not need this in every different kind of event, but if you're going to do something where teams are being generative or teams are working on some programming or coming up with ideas, things like that, then it may be useful to have a mentor, which is an experienced individual that can work directly with the teams or individuals at set times. So they'll drop in every once in a while and bounce some ideas around. They'll help vet, they'll give feedback, and then leave again. So these key roles for mentors are to find or meet with a team, to listen in and get asked questions, and then provide feedback on, give some of their thoughts on the direction that some of those teams may be taking. Your goals with mentors are to ensure that they're familiar with the tech functions, but they don't need to be as familiar as the facilitators because they are largely just dropping in during certain times. Largely, you're going to be thinking about recruiting the right mentors who will actually be able to provide the right type of information and support to your teams. And you don't just want to assume that the mentor will know how to work with a team. They may not have ever done that before, and you'll want to work with them on how to give feedback and provide some resources around what's good feedback, what's not good feedback, being positive, being generative and iterative. And finally, it's worth noting that you should over-explain to the mentors. They may need help on the day of event, and they may get confused because when you're in the event flow itself, you're speaking largely to your attendees, and the schedule that you have set is for your attendees. And so it's very easy for a mentor that maybe have just, taken a meeting to kind of preliminary understanding of what they were doing to drop in, see a different schedule, not quite know where they're going, and get confused and go, hold on, I thought we were doing X, Y, or Z. They're generally going to have a different schedule. If you can, And we did this for the Ideathon. If you can assign one of your facilitators specifically to mentors to make sure that, and to be kind of the handler in this, then that can be a really useful tool as well. So we had a private virtual breakout room that had all of the mentors in it. We had one facilitator in there at all times, and then that facilitator would sort of handhold that mentor and say, we're ready for you in this room. Here's the link, go over there and come back to this room when you're done, to try to make sure that that was a sort of traffic control position. So that's everything. And I am very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was awesome. So you're getting a lot of love for your slide template. So if you want to let folks know where you got that from, Steph, can I call on you to pull one question out of the chat? And then we're going to move on to Rebecca, because I just want to make sure we keep our promise to be done with the main presentations on the hour. So
yes, thanks, Lou. Number of questions, and I'll ask if at some point when we're finished here, if you could go into the doc and maybe add some answers, because you've given a lot of information here. So picking one, someone is using Hopin to organize a meeting. This is Diana, and a +1 from Arnie. Using Hopin to organize an event coming up. Do you have any advice for newcomers to this platform?
Yeah, I do. This is going to be specific to Hopin, but my advice with Hopin is that it is better for a buffet selection kind of a conference event than it is for a workshop where you would want people to move specifically through a series of activities from like, do this and then do step 2 and then do step 3. And you really can't do step 3 without doing 2 and 1 before it. Moving people through that pathway ended up becoming quite complicated for us. And this was why I was so thankful to have done those dry runs, because initially we thought that we were going to put them onto this platform, which has, a presentation view and then a breakout rooms area, an expo booths area, and a speed dating area. And that we would just tell people where to go. They would go there, they would do the activity. And then during that, we would tell them to go to the next place and they would go there. How naive I was. It was really difficult, and every one of those individual movement moments was an opportunity to lose people along the way, and it was just a moment of attrition. So what we ended up doing, despite all the bells and whistles with Hopin, was starting in the big presentation room and then sending everybody to their breakout rooms, and they stayed there for the rest of the last 5 hours of the day. And so we didn't end up doing a lot of the booths or the speed dating options anyway, which was the reason that we picked it in the first place. So those are really useful, and with Hopin specifically, if you wanted to do a buffet where you can drop in for a half hour, you can try some of the different things that are available at the time, and then you'll leave. So that's what I found. That I liked the layout and everything, but I think it would be a better fit for an event like that.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. There's a few more questions in the Google Doc, so if you want to pop in and answer them there, and also please share with us where you made your slide templates.
I will do so. Thank you all very much.
We'd all like to know. So yeah, thanks very much, Tom. So next up we have Rebecca, and Rebecca's inviting us to consider how we can expand the audience for our events by making them more accessible. So Rebecca, if you're able to screen share, please go ahead.
Yep. Can everybody see?
Yeah, that's perfect. Just put in presenter mode. Exactly. Great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm Rebecca Carpenter. I'm going to try to speed through and make sure I cover this topic entirely, but it's very in-depth. So this is really going to be a kind of surface presentation about making your meetings accessible to wider audiences, particularly thinking about individuals who have disabilities. So just a little bit about me. First, I've got both my bachelor's and my master's degree in the education of the deaf and hard of hearing, with classroom experience from kindergarten through 12th grade, as well as some tutoring experience at the university level. After graduating, I transitioned into a position tutoring as remedial math for just hearing students, but after doing that for a bit at a community college, I moved into disability services, where I would meet with students who needed accommodation at the university level, and then I would review their paperwork with the team and determine legally what accommodations they were entitled to. I also did a bit of interpreting here and there, mostly because they had a professor who requested last-minute interpreting services for meetings and stuff like that. About 5 or so years ago, I joined the Deaf and Hard of Hearing virtual academic community through RIT up in Rochester, New York, which is an alliance program that focuses on the academic preparation, the social isolation, as well as accessible materials for deaf and hard of hearing students who are in STEM majors. So I was hired as a community engagement manager, but I focused mainly on the online tutoring program that we ran, and took on the role as tutor myself and did many tutoring sessions remotely using, at the time, Google Hangouts, which has now become Google Meet, and Zoom. I also did some work with an outreach program where we did tutoring for students in another state using Zoom. So obviously listed in these things is not anything about being a legal expert. I'm definitely not a legal expert on anything disability related, but I do have some basic knowledge, and I just want to share some things with you so that you can consider it when you're planning your meetings. So the basics. I'm located in the United States, so I can really only talk legally about what's required here in the US. And so I would encourage you, if you're located somewhere else, to definitely do your research to figure out what's going to be required of you. But here we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was set up in 1990. And this was mostly focused on prohibiting discrimination for individuals with disabilities, so that they would have the same opportunities as their able-bodied peers. And this law mostly focused on defining what a disability was, which was an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And so anybody who falls under that umbrella is protected by this law. And it focuses on making sure that discrimination doesn't happen in areas like employment, voting, housing accommodation, transportation, but a big one is education. And when you're providing any sort of information online, you're going to most likely be viewing it through that educational lens. You're teaching people about something. And this law was set up mostly because historically there has been a documented events of individuals with disabilities being shunned or not included in activities that other people can have access to. So they are legally entitled to what is called reasonable accommodation. Now, what is considered reasonable is definitely a legal thing that I can't talk greatly on, but the important thing is that if you're providing something online, you should accommodate for the participants who are going to be there. So that's the legal part of it, but there's also a language part that's important to consider too. Most of the time, what is preferred is called person-first language. So when you're interacting with participants who have disabilities, most of the time it's a person with a disability, a person with a learning disability, a person with a physical disability. But there's also some cultural things, particularly when you're considering deaf and hard of hearing participants. They're not a person with hearing loss, they are a deaf person, if that's how they identify. That similarly happens within the autistic community as well. So when you're beginning to plan, one of the first things that you should consider is getting information and asking questions. A very big quote that came up when I worked in disability services was the idea of don't talk about us without us. And so you'll want to ask people what it is that they need. And the best way to probably do that is to send out a survey, especially now with everything being online. Before your event, ask do you need any accommodations? And then people can tell you what they are. It's really hard to get things set up appropriately to accommodate for people if you don't know about it in advance, especially with captioning and interpreting. It can be almost impossible to find an interpreter at the last minute, which is why I did some interpreting in the past. You'll also want to know about local or national resources that are available to you. There will be interpreting agencies and captioning agencies, some of them who can provide for a wide range of places and others that are more local to you. So you'll want to know about that, but as well as the technical aspect of it. If you're using Zoom, become familiar with how to use the captioning part of that platform and know how it works and practice it in advance so that you know what it is that you're doing, and becoming familiar with the individuals who work at that company for whatever platform it is that can help you learn those things as you're going along. So these are some good practices to consider when you are just setting the stage for your meeting. If you're going to be using voice, make sure that you're reducing the background noise. If you have a microphone, make sure that it's close to your mouth so that people can hear you clearly, especially for hard of hearing participants. They are going to want to be able to use their residual hearing to take in the information that you're providing. If you are going to be using the chat, sometimes something that's very helpful is to read what is in the chat out loud. This is not only just for people who are going to be using screen reader technology, which sometimes does a good job with reading it, but depending on the platform, that can be hit or miss, but also for people who just call in and can't see the chat. Reading it will make it accessible to a wider audience. If you're sharing things on a screen like I'm doing right now, it no longer becomes accessible to the screen reader. It's not something that somebody who is blind is going to have access to. And so one of the easiest ways to accommodate for that is reading what it is on the screen. Now, obviously, I'm not doing that right now, but I'm trying to get through a lot of things very quickly. And so this is more of a do as I say, not as I'm currently doing. If I had a longer presentation, I would be actively doing all of these things. But reading it out loud provides that information to an audience of people who would be not able to see what it is that you're sharing. Auto-generated captions are not accurate at all. I could spend probably the next several hours talking about this because half of my job is related to automatic speech recognition, particularly integrating it with captioning systems. And so when you want to consider captioning things, the auto-generated is just not enough, especially if you want people to learn things and to take things away from what it is that you're presenting. It's a good baseline. You can edit them for later, especially if you're talking about asynchronous resources, but synchronous, it's just not going to work. Turn-taking management is really important. We might not think about it as hearing individuals, but we tend to speak over each other frequently. And this is very difficult for captioning and for interpreting. And so if you can assign somebody who's in charge of determining who speaks when and in what order so that it's more organized, it's very helpful for making sure that your deaf and hard of hearing participants can follow along. If it's a large meeting, turning off the video for people who are not the speaker or the interpreter can just really dial back the amount of demand and the bandwidth required, because you don't want to spend all this time hiring and paying for an interpreter if they're not going to be seen clearly. You want to make sure that they're not going to be fuzzy, it's not going to be freezing, that sort of stuff. And then basic things like making sure that you have light coming from behind wherever it is that you're set up and coming towards your face, as opposed to from behind you, which is going to make you dark and harder to see. Having simple, high contrasting backgrounds so that it's easy to see your body and you and your face. And making sure that speakers are centered in the video, they're not off to the side, and that it's easy to see them. So considerations for working with interpreters and captionists. If you have never worked with an interpreter or a captionist before, the one thing that you would definitely want to do is speak to the deaf and hard of hearing person directly. You want to speak at a normal pace. You don't need to slow down or anything, but don't say things like, can you tell this person to do this? You're having a conversation with them. The interpreter or the captionist is just there to really kind of facilitate. If you have materials, share them in advance with your accommodation team, the interpreter or the captionist, so that they're aware of what it is that you'll be talking about and that they're prepared for that, especially if there's going to be any specific vocabulary that needs to be addressed. Don't ask the interpreter or the captionist to stop recording or signing what it is that's going on. Anything from the beginning of the meeting until the very end will be interpreted or captioned by that individual. And historically, there is a big thing about deaf and hard of hearing people being left out of conversations, and so do not ask for them to stop doing something, especially if all of the hearing people who are attending have access to it. Like I mentioned before, they're there to facilitate communication. They're not there to serve as tech support or to teach you about deaf culture or deaf people. They're just there to do their job, which is to interpret or caption. If you have a long meeting, longer than 90 minutes, there will be multiple people assigned. Definitely for interpreters, sometimes for captionists, depending, and that's just on the physical impact of just doing that repetitive motion again and again, and so they swap off during it. Some phrasing, you'll want to talk about our interpreter or the interpreter. They're not just there for the deaf person. They're there for you because you don't know how to sign. And so they're serving a purpose of helping you and helping them. There's also going to be a lag between the time when you say words and the interpreter takes it in, translates to another language, and produces it. There's definitely a lag there. And so when you're asking questions, you'll want to consider that. Make sure that you give enough time for the interpreter to stop interpreting so that the deaf person can take in that information, process the question, and then provide it to you or to them, depending on the situation. If you're using something like Zoom in particular, which is what I'm most familiar with, you'll want to figure out how to pin that interpreter so that they're always seen by the deaf and hard of hearing person and they don't get lost as things change. And make sure that you give time to the visuals that you are presenting before speaking. It's impossible to look at a PowerPoint, to look at you speaking, and an interpreter simultaneously, especially if the PowerPoint is wordy. And so best practice is to show your visual, give a minute for people to look at it, to read it, and then start talking. And then any video materials that you're going to be sharing should be captioned in advance so that they're accessible to an audience who is deaf and hard of hearing. So just going to kind of briefly go through the asynchronous part of it. So say you have planned a meeting, you go through it and you record it and say, I want to make this available to people to watch later. What is it that you need to consider? Well, any video material that you create needs to have closed captioning with it. Software like Zoom, you can have the ability to, when you save it to the cloud, it will provide a transcript for you, but it will definitely need to be edited because it uses some sort of ASR software. I'm not exactly sure what, so it's not going to be accurate. So you can edit it yourself, or you can find a captioning agency and work with them to caption the video for you. Make sure that things that you share are screen reader or have accessible options. So if you share a PDF of your PowerPoint, it's not going to be read correctly by screen reader software, but you can just very easily make a notepad file that has the text and description of any visuals that you have in there, and that can be an alternate that you provide to people. Speaking of alternate, if you include images, you'll want to make sure that they are all tagged for alternate text. which basically tells a screen reader software when it goes over it, what it is that the person would be looking at. If you don't include it, it just jumps over that information. And so if you've included an image, it serves some sort of purpose. And you want to make sure that blind individuals who are participating have access to that. Similarly, use the headings. Within Microsoft products, you have the option to put in this is a heading or it's a title. Making something bold or underlining it doesn't change the way that it's classified within the software. And so screen readers will see all of it as just text. It does not going to differentiate. And when you use things like headings or titles, it allows the screen reader software to jump around. And so for people to find what it is that they're looking for. Hyperlinks that you include should convey important information. You want to avoid things like click here, and the here is the hyperlink. It doesn't tell somebody who's using a screen reader where it is that that link is taking them to. So it conveys some kind of information with it. Tables that you've included, you'll want to make sure are used sparingly because they're not super accessible with screen readers. Sometimes the easiest thing that you can do is take a complex table and break it down into multiple simpler ones, but you can also use things like HTML or Adobe products to make more accessible tables. And then also don't really struggle to do this on your own. Use the built-in tools that are in the software, like the headings. Use the bullet points that are available to you through the products that you're using. But also, in particular, Microsoft products have an accessibility checker in them, which will tell you the problems in your PowerPoint slides or in your Word documents so that you can fix them before you make them available to a bigger audience. And so I'm curious if anybody has any questions.
Hi, thanks very much, Rebecca. Thank you for walking us through all those super resources and really getting us thinking about all the things that we may not be doing by default. There are a bunch of questions in the Google Doc, and in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we let Emily give her presentation as well, so we can fit as much of that in as possible. So let's do that. Rebecca, feel free to check out the Google Doc and start answering questions there. And then what we'll do once Emily has spoken is take questions for both Rebecca and Emily. So Rebecca, over to you. I'm sorry, Emily, over to you, please. Emily, are you still there? She was talking about computer issues right when we started, so hopefully they haven't kicked in.
Looks like she's here, but she's muted and her video's turned off.
Uh-oh.
Hi, sorry, my Zoom froze. So hopefully my computer can survive the next 15 minutes, and if it dies after that, I'll consider it a success. So bear with me. Like a lot of us, our computers seem to be protesting these days. All right, so I'd like to start out by thanking Lou and Katie for inviting me to present today. And I'd also like to thank Tom and Rebecca for their presentations. I certainly learned a lot today. So I really enjoyed both of your presentations. And some of what I'll be talking about today builds on the ideas that Tom and Rebecca shared. So for those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm Emily, and I work with Code for Science and Society. And I am the Data Science Conference Fund Manager. So since January, I've been developing a program to fund conferences and events in research-driven open data science. So this has been a really weird time to be transitioning into a position as a conference fund manager. But in June, we released our first call for proposals for virtual events in research-driven open data science. So for any of you who are in the open data science sphere and you're thinking about planning events for 2021 and you're looking for funding, I'd be happy to chat with you at some point. So over the last few months, I've been thinking a lot about best practices in virtual conference planning, and I've been attending as many virtual meetings as possible and talking to conference organizers about their experiences in transitioning their traditionally in-person meetings online. So essentially, what's been really fun about this, from my perspective anyway, is that we're all pioneers in this space and we're all learning together. And there's a lot of opportunities for creativity and innovation. So some of the questions that I'll be raising today, and I certainly won't be answering these in any great detail, I'll be providing some kind of high level considerations and questions for virtual conference or event organizers. Would be, who is in the best position to host an event? What skills do organizers need? How do you choose a platform? How do you choose a format? And how can organizers, attendees, and funders evaluate success? So I think there are a lot of challenges in planning meetings, particularly in planning virtual events. But I think two challenges that are really specific to planning virtual events are, how do you keep attendees engaged? And how do you foster interactions among participants and presenters? So one of the challenges that I've heard in conversations with different event organizers is that, unlike in-person meetings, you don't have the undivided attention of your participants or attendees in virtual meetings. They have whatever's going on at home distracting them. They have their day jobs to pay attention to. And so I think one of the key challenges for organizers is thinking about how to keep attendees coming back every day and how to get them to attend as many sessions as possible and participate fully. And then with regard to the second challenge, how do you foster interactions among participants and presenters? So at in-person meetings, there are plenty of opportunities for impromptu hallway conversations and social time. And there are also, maybe prescribed formal networking opportunities. And that can be really challenging to replicate in virtual space. So I've certainly seen virtual meetings that have Zoom rooms that are for hallway conversation. I'm not really sure at this point to what extent they're fully used, because again, there are other aspects of participants' lives that are keeping them from potentially fully engaging. And I think you also need to kind of inspire participants to take advantage of these extra opportunities. So those are two considerations to think about when planning your virtual event. So in terms of who is in the best position to host an event, my first reaction is you, anybody. I think one of the cool things about virtual events is that it really lowers the barrier to being an event organizer. You don't have the travel burden. The cost of hosting a virtual event can be much less than the cost of hosting an in-person event. And so I really think that this opens the door to new and emerging conference organizers and events. And hopefully we'll see more diversity in conference organizers and events as well. But I think two types of people who may be particularly well positioned would be educators and community managers. So I say educators, particularly those people who have experience online teaching, because they already have the experience talking and engaging people in an online format, and thinking about kind of innovative ways to get people learning new things and interacting in virtual space. And then also community managers, because they know their community. So they know what the community wants to get out of events, and they know how the community members socialize, and they know how they network well, how to get them interacting in virtual space. And then in terms of thinking about what skills organizers need, I'm going to echo a lot of what Tom said, where you don't want to be organizing your event alone. So it's really important to have a trusted team of individuals, including facilitators and support staff or volunteers, as Tom mentioned, because there really are a lot of different strengths and experiences that are needed to do an event well. And I've listed some of them here. I don't think any of us possess all of these strengths or all of these skills. And even if one of us is a superhero and has all of these skills in their toolkit, you don't want to be the only one there as the point person for your meeting. So again, it is really important to assemble a diverse team in creating your event where you have people who have these different skills, who can work together to pull off a well-rounded, inclusive event. And again here, I want to point out that you shouldn't be afraid to innovate. So I think, again, one of the strengths of virtual meetings is that we can no longer fall back on the traditions of in-person meetings. And it's really a time to reconsider what we want to get out of events. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities for innovation in this space. So just touching on how you choose a platform, there is this resource that's on the Google Doc called the Ultimate Webinar Live Streaming List, and it has comprehensive information on 65 platforms. And this is obviously really overwhelming, at least I find it really overwhelming. And so some of the advice that I have in choosing a platform for your event is to talk to conference organizers, see what worked well for them, see what they liked about the platform they chose, why they chose that particular platform, and also figure out what maybe some downfalls are. I also recommend that you attend virtual meetings to see what works well. So since a lot of virtual meetings now are free or are very inexpensive to attend, I recommend registering and attending as many as you can so you can get a sense for different platforms and what you like in each one. As Tom said, definitely practice in advance, particularly if you're using a platform that is new to you. And this also helps you to make sure that the speakers know how to use the platform and that their talks are going to be in the allotted space so that you can stay on schedule. There are a lot of benefits to being able to practice in advance. And again, as Tom said, make sure you have dedicated tech support so that there are identified individuals who can help with technical problems as they arise. And also take the time to onboard participants. So again, if you're introducing a new platform that participants haven't used before, take the time to have onboarding sessions with them so that they can learn how to navigate the platform. So a really good example of this that I have encountered recently is with the Earth Science Information Partners meeting that's going on right now. They're using a platform called KikoChat, which I had never heard of prior to attending the meeting. And the first time I logged in, I was really overwhelmed. It was a lot to take in. But Erin Robinson, one of the meeting organizers, has been really good. Just about every day of the meeting, she has held multiple sessions. And they're just 15-minute sessions where you can go and she will walk you through KikoChat and you can learn about all of its functionality. And so I think that really helps with participant retention, getting them comfortable using the platform. Okay, and then how do you choose a format? So my suggestion here is to make it interactive. People don't want to be talked to on Zoom all day long. That's very tiring. But think about things like breakout rooms and using collaborative documents and having live question and answer sessions, using Slack. So think about ways to get people interacting with each other, both over video and also over in writing. And also think about synchronous interactions versus asynchronous interactions. And so this helps to accommodate people who prefer talking one-on-one in a video session versus being able to leave maybe anonymous feedback on a poster, and also taking into consideration people from different time zones. So how can you welcome participants from different time zones if you're hosting a global event? So some of the things to think about are having separate schedules for different hemispheres. So the BCC 2020 meeting is a really great example of this, where they have conference organizers both in the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. And they actually have separate schedules for each of the hemispheres so that folks around the world can enjoy a combination of live and pre-recorded events. CarpentryCon at Home is another great example of this, where there are sessions held throughout the day to accommodate people from different time zones. So it'll be challenging, and if you're planning to do this, I recommend that you have conference organizers who can serve as regional hosts to help make sure that the programming goes smoothly around the globe. And again, this is another reason to include asynchronous means of providing feedback and interacting as well. So how can event organizers evaluate success? So you've run your meeting, you survived it. Can you call it a success? So what sort of metrics should you be thinking about? And you should be thinking about evaluating success from the early planning stages of your event. So Tom mentioned starting with why. And so another way to think about this, for those of you who have education backgrounds, is backward design. So as an event organizer, the first thing that you want to do is identify your goals or your desired results. So these might be the big ideas and skills that you want your participants to come away with. And once you've identified your goals, you want to figure out how you'll know that you've met your goals. So what evidence will you have that your participants have achieved your desired goals? So in education, you would think about assessment, but from an event organization standpoint, you want to think about what types of evidence you can collect. And then lastly, your third step is that you'll want to actually plan your activities or your talks during your event. So the key here is making sure that the experiences and instruction, the events that you provide to your participants are in alignment with your goals. So this helps you to have a focused event. And then also, I think there's a lot of opportunities for reflection. So what can you do differently? So what worked well from the standpoint of presenters and participants, and what might you do differently next time? You can also think about participant retention. So what percentage of people who registered for your event showed up on day 1 versus day 4? Did you see a lot of attrition throughout the week? Or did you see that people were coming back session after session, day after day? And then participation, to what extent were your attendees actually able to participate? Did you see that there were just a few folks who were coming every day and asking questions, or was the participation more spread evenly? And I think a key question to ask as you're defining your goals is making sure that the events for your goals are in alignment with the goals for your community members, and making sure that you articulate your goals to your community and to the participants who will be attending the event. So how can event attendees evaluate success? Some questions to ask yourself as you're attending virtual events. Did the event align with its goals? So did I get out of this event what the event organizers claimed I would? What did I learn? Who did I connect with? What new partnerships or collaborations might result from this event? Was I able to participate to the extent that I wanted to? So for some reason, did I have to hold back my participation due to not being able to access the materials, or being in a time zone that wasn't accommodated? What other barriers to participation did I experience? And lastly, after attending the event, how will I improve my practice? So based on the new connections that I made and the new information or skills that I gained, how will that influence my research or my practice in the future? And I think one key component of evaluating success from the standpoint of organizers is to make sure that you are surveying the participants and attendees and presenters at your event and getting their feedback, and perhaps maybe going beyond a typical, survey monkey survey, and actually doing some interviews, having conversations with people who attended the event to get more candid feedback. And then how can funders evaluate success? So in my shoes, as someone who manages a program that funds open data science events, these are some questions that I'm thinking about when I evaluate the success of the events that we'll be funding. So did the event broaden participation in the field? Did the event incorporate inclusive practices? Did the event fill a niche or a gap? What skills or information did the participants learn? What were the measurable outcomes? How was information shared with the broader community? and how is community built or sustained? And so one of the things to think about here, again, is being in alignment with the community's goals. So our community members looking to go to an event and then leave and not have any follow-up, or our community members interested in having more follow-up and engaging in longer-term relationships with other members of the community. Oops. So in addition to the really great guidebook that just came out from CSCCE, which I'm really excited about, I've also been compiling conference planning resources on our webpage, and this is also linked in the Google Doc. And this has a combination of best practices in event planning in general, also a special focus on virtual events, and considerations in terms of inclusivity and accessibility. So if you are planning an event, I do encourage you to check this out. And if there are resources that are missing that you think should be on there, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to include them. This is by no means comprehensive. So with that, again, I'd like to thank you. I'm really excited by how many of you are interested in planning virtual events. And I'd be happy to have follow-up conversations if you have resources or experiences that you'd like to share, or if you want to talk more about best practices in virtual conference planning. I also, if this is a topic you're really interested in, Rachel Ainsworth and I are co-hosting a Carpentry Con at Home session on August 5th with a couple of other individuals. So if I would encourage you to either come to the live event or you can check out the YouTube video afterward. And that's all I had.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Emily. Thanks for walking us through lots of good points and lots of nice synergy with the other presentations. So thanks for rounding us out. So while we're still recording, Steph, can I call on you to ask us a question each? So a question for Rebecca and a question for Emily from what's been placed in the doc. And then we're going to open up for broader conversation after that.
Yes, I can. So my question on behalf of potential applicants to ask of Emily is, for this fund, what is the deadline for applications? And are you hosting any future Ask Me Anything sessions? How can people here connect with you to get more information?
Yeah, good question. So applications are open until August 25th. So applicants have about a month left to put their applications together. I hosted 2 AMA sessions in July, and all of the notes from those sessions are on the website under the FAQ page. And if there is interest, I'd be happy to host another event in early August. So that is TBD at this point.
Thank you, Emily. And for Rebecca, first of all, I have to thank Tom and Rebecca. I can't thank Emily yet because she just finished. Emily, please go in and add any other notes in the document. But Tom and Rebecca have done such an outstanding job of putting in answers to people's questions. And the thing before the notes were added and more discussion happened, the question for Rebecca that was overwhelming is people asking for resources for interpreters, resources for everything that's in your brain that you said in your presentation. So maybe Rebecca, can you highlight 1 or 2 key resources that you'd point people to?
Sure. I would say when it comes to looking for interpreting and captioning, definitely look into local resources. That's who I would go to first. But when you're planning an online meeting, you are possibly going to want to look into places that do a wider range of services. So in particular, I listed the link for 2 companies, one that's called Purple Communications and the other one that's called Sorensen. They are both companies that provide video phone services for individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. So like somebody who is deaf wanted to call into their doctor's office and book an appointment, they have interpreters on staff who work with them, and they will also provide interpreting services at, obviously there's a fee for it, but they'll work with people online to do that sort of stuff. In terms of resources for making things just accessible in general, and a lot of the things that I touched on, I included some links. The first one is for an organization called DeafTech that is run through RIT, and they have a lot of the information about online teaching and learning and best practices for deaf and hard of hearing students. Now, obviously, some of it is going to be kind of classroom oriented, which may not work for you. But if you think about presenting a workshop or planning a meeting online, it is kind of like a classroom. And so when you view it from an educational perspective, there's definitely some benefit to take from that, as well as a resource that it was developed by Gallaudet University, which is a totally deaf university, about, in particular, using Zoom. And I also included a couple of Microsoft resources about using their software to make things accessible for screen readers in particular. I think that answers your question. Okay, good.
Great, thank you very much. So let me thank all three speakers. So thank you, Tom, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Emily. We have recorded the first part of this call, so this will be processed and it will be the first of our community calls to get uploaded to our new YouTube channel. So watch this space if you want to share this on further with colleagues and friends. And then Katie also will be putting together a blog post summarising some of the key findings. The Google Doc is going to be open for 24 hours, so if you've got any additional thoughts, any questions, or the speakers want to come in and drop in any further responses to things, please do that. Then we'll lock it for edits and we'll share that as a resource as well. So thank you very much.